Hello, my name is Jacob Thompson, and welcome back to the Wisdom of Odin. Today, I am very clearly in London, and when most people come visit here for the first time, one of the first things they're going to check out is Big Ben behind me here. And normally it is insanely crowded, more crowded than it is now, because this is one of the most popular tourist attractions in the world. But when I first came here, I wasn't focused on Big Ben as much as I was focused on the statue behind me here that you can barely see, that is surrounded by tourist merchandise and memorabilia. But the statue behind me here is of a really badass woman in history, and her name is Boudica. And she survives today even as a British hero, despite the fact that she was from the pagan era. And the story behind her is really interesting. And so that is what I'm going to share with you today, is the story of the badass Briton named Boudica. So Boudica lived in the 1st century CE in modern-day England. Now at this time, the people of this region were called the Britons. The Britons began to migrate from France around 1300 BC. Now, a lot of the information we have between 1300 BC and the time of the Romans is very limited. The Romans began setting down roots in around 43 CE, around the same time they had conquered the Gauls. One of their first settlements is where I'm at right now. One of the first cities they established in modern-day England was Londinium, and Londinium still stands today. So that's one of the interesting things about this place that I'm in, is that this was originally a Roman city, and quite a large Roman city by the end of the Roman era. Like much of history, most of the people around Britannia were parts of small tribes that had unique cultures, traditions, and religious practices. If you ever look up the list of Briton gods, there are so many different Romanized versions of the Briton deities, and so it really seems that almost every single tribe had different deities that they venerated, perhaps centering around a few common ones, but there were many different deities in this area, many which we do not know today. Boudica was the queen of the Iceni tribe, which exists in modern-day Norfolk, so not too far away from modern-day London. The Iceni were quite rebellious, and they were one of the first tribes to really rebel against Roman rule. In 47 CE, the Iceni revolted against the Romans because the Romans at the time wanted to take away their weapons, and the Iceni revolted. They actually ended up winning the revolt, and Rome allowed them to keep their weapons and allowed them to stay a kingdom in the eyes of Rome, of course, as long as they put Rome ahead of themselves. And so the Iceni were fairly wealthy, as they were the printer of coins at this time as well. My apologies for probably butchering the name of this next person I'm about to read. Boudica was married to Prasutagus, a Roman sympathizer that ended up dying pretty early on into his reign. Not before having 2 daughters with Boudica, and upon his death, Prasutagus left his kingdom to his daughters, but also to the empire. The Romans did not take kindly to him leaving his kingdom to his 2 daughters, despite still leaving it to the emperor. And so the Romans came in and assaulted the daughters and flogged Boudica. Naturally, the Iceni did not take too kindly to this, and neither did Boudica, who used this as the platform to launch her uprising against the Romans. High taxation and poor leadership, mixed with the abuses to the Britons, were the fuel to this fire that was set off by the assault of Boudica, who was able to raise an army of over 120,000 for her first assault on a Roman city. Her first attack was on the modern-day city of Colchester, not sparing anyone in the process. There was an absolutely no prisoners policy within Boudica's campaign. This is an important moment to mention. The reason we know so many details about Boudica and her campaign against the Romans is because so many Romans wrote about them.
A terrible disasters occurred in Britain. 2 cities were sacked. 80,000 of the Romans and all of their allies perished. Moreover, all this ruin is brought upon the Romans by a woman, a fact which itself caused them the greatest shame. The person who is chiefly instrumental in rousing the natives and persuading them to fight the Romans, the person who is thought worthy to be their leader and who directed the conduct of the entire war, was Boudica, a Briton woman of a royal family and possessed of greater intelligence than often belongs to women. In stature she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, in a glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips. Around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of divers colors, often in which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire.
Hopefully you can tell in that passage that the Romans actually were terrified of her, and in certain passages I think admired her tenacity and ability to strike fear into the people that she was massacring. As you know, the Romans were quite negative towards the Druids and the people that practiced their traditional religions if they did not adopt the Roman ways. They saw them as savages and barbarians for how they conducted their religious ceremonies. So a lot of the times their recording of these ceremonies is quite brutal. So when I read to you this ritual that Boudica supposedly performed, understand that the Romans may have painted it in a negative light, but still it paints a very ghastly but also magical image of who Boudica was.
They would then take noble women and impale them on spikes in sacred groves. They would then cut off their breast and then sew them in their mouths as sacrifices to Andraste. She then employed a method of divination, letting a hair escape from the fold of her dress, and since it ran what they considered the auspicious side, the whole multitude shouted with pleasure, and Boudica, raising her hands toward the heavens, and said,
I thank thee, Andraste, and call upon thee as woman speaking to woman, for us, mistress, be thou alone ever our leader.
Boudica most likely was a priestess or someone with spiritual connection, as she was the one performing these rituals. And so now you have a woman, assaulted, beaten, her daughters assaulted and beaten, her husband dead, leading a resistance of 120,000 Britons against the Romans, who was divining sacred messages from the gods, particularly Andraste. This is pretty badass, right? Now, obviously, this is a very aggressive story, but one that is quite impressive for the time. The Roman governor, Gaius Paulinius, was leading a campaign in Wales when he received words of Boudica's campaign in Colchester. And he also received word that her next target was Londinium. So Gaius left a detachment of Romans at the Isle of Anglesey and began his march down south to try to intercept Boudica before she reached Londinium. Gaius did not have a lot of troops and knew he was gravely outnumbered, and so his main objective was to evacuate the city of Londinium. Of course, this is maybe, again, a height of the Romans recording this, the hero of Gaius saving the women and children of Londinium, and the savage Boudica slaying everyone that she saw. So perhaps this is, again, a Roman fabrication to show Romans in a good light, but regardless, this is the story that we know. Gaius did suffer a defeat at Londinium as he sent some soldiers to distract Boudica's forces, who were all, of course, massacred, and then he retreated to gather more men. While Gaius was retreating, Boudica did raze Londinium to the ground and then moved to modern-day St. Albans, where she did the same. Boudica's army now stretched over 200,000 men, and they were gaining quite a lot of speed. At this time, the Emperor Nero was hearing about this campaign of Boudica and how much devastation that she was causing to Britannia. And it is suggested that if this campaign was successful, Emperor Nero would have ceased all operations in Britannia. It is at this time we also reach the shame of Boudica, and that her army of over 200,000 lost to the Roman army of 10,000 and were absolutely massacred, Boudica herself losing her life within the battle. Now, the accounts of how Boudica died in the battle against the Romans vary. I have seen some accounts that she was poisoned, some that she took her own life, and some that she died on the battlefield. Regardless, I have seen that her body was taken away from the battlefield and given a heroic burial by the Britons. Despite this loss, Boudica's campaign did see 3 victories and 3 Roman cities razed to the ground, and not to mention the fear that she stuck into the hearts of the Romans, including Emperor Nero, so much so that many Roman writers wrote down her tales. Now, interestingly enough, the Romans did actually record these battle cries and war speeches that she supposedly gave. Obviously, there's no way of knowing if these are what was actually said, but I do find them quite interesting and powerful.
You have learned by actual experience how different freedom is from slavery, although some among you may previously, through ignorance of which was better, have been deceived by the alluring promises of the Romans. You have learned how great a mistake you made in preferring an imported despotism to your ancestral mode of life. But to speak the plain truth, it is we who have made ourselves responsible for all these evils, in that we have allowed them to set foot on the island in the first place instead of expelling them at once as we did with their famous Julius Caesar. Let us, therefore, go against them trusting boldly to good fortune. Let us show them that they are hares and foxes trying to rule over dogs and wolves.
It is at this time that the story of Boudica does come to an end, because at her death there was no more writings about her. There is one artifact I can share with you that was possibly erected to Boudica sometime after her death as a votive shrine that has been found in England. But it is not known if this is a tombstone of hers. We don't know the actual burial area of Boudica, and it's almost impossible to tell, and we most likely will never know. However, this shrine erected to someone of a very similar name may give us some hint to where she was buried, or at the very least how highly prized she was by the Briton people. For the most part, Boudica faded into memory at this time. It wasn't until the Renaissance when the aristocracy of England were able to get a hold of Roman writings for the first time, particularly about these campaigns, and Boudica became more of a popular figure among writings but also in poetry. And this fame continued on through the Romantic era, and many different statues, stained glass windows, and creative works have been made to Boudica over the years, and she is considered a national hero of Britain today. Now, Boudica today is a little bit different. People aren't as excited about Boudica as they were probably during the Renaissance, and it's probably because the fact that she has been over-analyzed, over-talked about, and she is very well known here in Britain today. And so I think it's very similar to Ragnar Lothbrok in the Vikings TV show. Most people didn't know who Ragnar Lothbrok was until the Vikings TV show came out, and then it started turning towards the cringy, and I think that's very similar to what happened to Boudica, as she was talked about so much has been made about her. There's been children's stories, books written about her, TV shows, movies, and so I think a lot of people are just tired of Boudica. But for someone like me who has never heard of her until I came and started researching the Romans, I'm actually very interested in her history and who this woman was. A lot of people also don't like Boudica because of her savagery, because when you actually look at her story, she was very savage, and I think a lot of people are like, should we be holding someone up who literally cut off the breasts of women and sewed them into their mouths? But I think the counter argument to that I believe in as well is the fact that the Romans and most people living during this time were just as savage and just as brutal, and that no one in ancient history survives when we hold them over a magnifying glass of our modern standards. The last reason I think a lot of people are starting to question whether or not we should hold Boudica up is the fact that she ultimately lost the war. She lost pretty badly. She had an army of over 200,000 going against 10,000, and she lost. But once again, my retort to this is the fact that everyone lost to the Romans, or at least the majority of people lost to the Romans. The Druids lost to the Romans. The Gauls lost to the Romans. Yeah, we still look at these as important parts of history, or we still research them. So I don't think there's anything wrong at looking at Boudica and saying, look, this woman won 3 battles against the Romans, terrified the Romans. And that is the identity that I'm going to carry with me, and the identity that I'm sharing with you now is the badass Briton named Boudica.